The rain hammered against the transparent dome covering New Geneva Station like bullets from heaven. Marcus Chen pulled his maintenance jacket tighter as he walked through the crowded marketplace, tools clanking softly in his belt. The station buzzed with activity as usual, merchants hawking exotic goods from distant worlds, diplomats in flowing robes discussing trade agreements, and tourists gawking at the mix of alien species that called this place home. Marcus had been working as a systems engineer on the station for 3 years now. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. The Galactic Council had established New Geneva as a neutral trading post, where dozens of species could meet and conduct business. Humans were still relatively new to this cosmic community, having joined only 15 years ago after first contact with the Zentari Empire. As he navigated through the crowd toward Section C, where a cooling unit needed repair, something caught his eye. Near the fountain in the central plaza, a small figure huddled against the base of a statue depicting the first peace treaty between species. The figure was clearly not human. Her skin had a pale blue tint that shifted to silver in the artificial light, and her hair was white as starlight. She looked young, maybe equivalent to a human teenager, though with aliens it was always hard to tell. What struck Marcus wasn't her appearance, but her condition. She was obviously starving. Her clothes, which might have once been fine, were now tattered and dirty. Her limbs were thin, and she shivered despite the station's controlled climate. Most telling of all, she held out a small container with trembling hands, clearly begging for food or credits. The plaza was packed with beings from across the galaxy, yet everyone walked past her as if she didn't exist. Marcus watched for several minutes, fascinated and horrified. A group of well-dressed Zentari merchants stepped around her without a glance. A delegation of crystalline Vorthak actually walked through the space where she sat, their energy forms briefly illuminating her desperate face before moving on. Even other humans, station personnel and tourists alike, avoided eye contact and hurried past. Marcus knew enough about galactic society to understand what he was seeing. The girl appeared to be a Catharian, a species that had fallen from grace in spectacular fashion. Once, the Catharians had been among the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, masters of quantum technology and dimensional sciences. They'd been proud, aloof, and had considered themselves superior to most other species, including humans, whom they'd viewed as primitive newcomers. But pride, as Marcus's grandmother used to say, comes before the fall. 5 years ago, the Catharian homeworld had suffered a catastrophic dimensional cascade failure. Their experiments with parallel universe technology had backfired, tearing their planet apart at the quantum level. Billions had died, and the survivors were scattered across the galaxy as refugees. The galactic community had provided some initial aid, but as time passed and resources grew tight, support dwindled. The Catharians, who had once looked down on others, found themselves at the bottom of the social ladder. What made it worse was that many species hadn't forgotten the Catharians' previous arrogance. They'd been dismissive of other civilizations' struggles, refusing aid when it was requested, claiming that inferior species should solve their own problems. Now, that same attitude was being turned back on them. Galactic society had collectively decided that if the Catharians thought they were so superior, they could figure out their refugee crisis alone. Marcus watched as a Zentari security officer approached the girl. The officer, a tall being with golden scales and multiple arms, looked down at her with obvious disgust. "Move along," the officer commanded in the universal translation language that all citizens were required to understand. "No begging in the commercial sectors." The girl looked up with eyes that seemed to hold the depth of space itself, a deep purple that swirled with flecks of silver. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, so soft that Marcus had to strain to hear through the crowd noise. "Please, I haven't eaten in 4 days. I'm not asking for charity, I can work. I have engineering knowledge, quantum mechanics, dimensional theory." The Zentari officer's laugh was harsh. Right. Every Catherian refugee claims to be a genius. If your people were so smart, how did you blow up your own planet? The officer's hand moved to the stun baton on his belt. I said move along. Don't make me arrest you for disturbing the peace. The girl struggled to her feet, swaying slightly from weakness. She gathered her few possessions, a small pack that looked like it contained everything she owned, and began to shuffle away toward the darker, less patrolled sections of the station. Marcus noticed that she moved with careful dignity despite her obvious desperation, trying to maintain some semblance of pride even in these circumstances. Something twisted in Marcus's chest as he watched her go. He'd grown up poor in the housing blocks of Earth's new Shanghai megalopolis. He knew what hunger looked like, what desperation felt like, but more than that, he recognized something in the girl's eyes that reminded him of his younger sister, a stubborn refusal to give up even when the world seemed determined to crush you. Marcus glanced around the plaza again. The crowd had already moved on, the brief confrontation forgotten. Business continued as usual. Credits changed hands, deals were struck, and the galaxy's economy churned forward without missing a beat. No one cared about one starving refugee. But Marcus found himself thinking about his grandmother again, and the stories she used to tell about the old days on Earth before the climate wars, when humanity had been scattered and struggling. She'd always said that what made humans special wasn't their technology or their strength, but their ability to see suffering and choose to act, even when no one else would. The cooling unit in Section C could wait. Marcus adjusted his tool belt and followed the girl into the shadows of the station's lower levels. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. Something about the way she'd maintained her dignity in the face of humiliation, the way she'd offered to work instead of just begging, reminded him that behind the politics and prejudice, she was just a person in need. The lower levels of New Geneva Station were a different world from the gleaming commercial sectors above. Here, the walls were bare metal instead of decorative panels, and the lighting was dimmer to save power. This was where the maintenance tunnels ran, where the waste recycling systems hummed, and where those who couldn't afford upper-level accommodations made their homes in converted storage bays and abandoned offices. Marcus followed the soft sound of footsteps through the maze of corridors. The girl moved like she knew where she was going, which suggested she'd been living down here for a while. He wondered how long she'd been on the station, how she'd ended up here, and why none of the refugee assistance programs seemed to be helping her. He found her in what had once been a small conference room, now clearly serving as her makeshift shelter. She'd managed to activate an emergency light panel, casting a pale glow over her few belongings spread on the floor. She sat with her back against the wall, her eyes closed, looking exhausted. Marcus cleared his throat softly to announce his presence. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, fear flashed across her face. Then she saw his maintenance uniform and relaxed slightly, though she remained wary. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know this area is restricted. I'll move on." "Wait," Marcus said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not here to kick you out. I saw what happened upstairs." She studied his face carefully as if trying to determine his intentions. "You're human," she observed. "Marcus Chen," he said, introducing himself. "Station maintenance." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "My name is Lyra Vashitai." She pronounced it with a musical quality that the universal translator couldn't quite capture. Marcus sat down across from her, keeping his distance so she wouldn't feel threatened. "When's the last time you ate?" Lyra's hand instinctively moved to her stomach. "I told the security officer the truth. 4 days, maybe 5. Time becomes unclear when you're hungry." "There are refugee assistance programs," Marcus said. "Food distribution centers. Haven't you applied?" Lyra's laugh was bitter. Oh, I've applied. Do you know what they tell me? That my species is classified as low priority for assistance. The Zentari Empire controls most of the refugee programs, and they've made it clear that Catherians are at the bottom of the list. Her voice carried a mix of anger and resignation. They say we should be grateful for any help at all, considering how we treated other species in the past. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. That's not right. Need is need. Politics shouldn't enter into it. You really believe that? Lyra asked, studying him with those deep, purple eyes. Your species is still new to galactic society. Give it time. You'll learn how things really work out here. Maybe, Marcus said. Or maybe we'll change how things work. He stood up. Wait here, I'll be back. Before Lyra could respond, he was already heading for the door. As he walked back toward the upper levels, Marcus's mind was racing. He thought about the emergency ration supplies in the maintenance department, the unofficial network of human workers who looked out for each other, and the small apartment he rented in the residential sector. He thought about his grandmother's stories and his sister's stubborn courage. Most of all, he thought about the look in Lyra's eyes. Not just the hunger and desperation, but the intelligence and dignity that hunger couldn't erase. If the galaxy wanted to write off the Catherians because of past politics, that was the galaxy's choice. But Marcus Chen had his own choices to make. The upper levels seemed even more garish and artificial as he passed through them again. All that wealth and comfort, while a few levels down, someone starved because of bureaucratic cruelty. It reminded him why he'd never been particularly impressed with galactic civilization, despite all its technological wonders. Marcus made his way to the maintenance department's supply room. As a senior technician, he had access to emergency rations, high-calorie food bars designed to sustain workers during long repairs in remote sections of the station. He stuffed several into his pockets, along with a thermos of hot coffee from the break room. His next stop was his own quarters. Marcus lived simply, a small apartment with basic furniture and few luxuries. But he had clean clothes that might fit Lyra, and more importantly, he had access to the station's personnel networks. If Lyra was as intelligent as she claimed, maybe there was a way to get her legitimate work instead of charity. As he gathered supplies, Marcus found himself thinking about humanity's place in the galactic community. They were still the newcomers, still proving themselves worthy of respect. But maybe that was an advantage. They hadn't yet learned to be callous, hadn't yet accepted that some suffering was just the way things were. His grandmother had been right about one thing. What made humans special wasn't their technology or their strength. It was their stubborn refusal to accept that cruelty was inevitable, their insistence on seeing individuals instead of just statistics and politics. Marcus packed everything into a maintenance bag and headed back to the lower levels. He didn't know if what he was doing would make a real difference in the long run, but he knew it would make a difference today, for one person. And sometimes, that was enough to start changing the world. When he returned to the makeshift shelter, Lyra was exactly where he'd left her, though she'd clearly been crying. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes widened when she saw the bag he carried. "I brought food," Marcus said simply. "And I think we need to talk about getting you out of here." Lyra stared at the food bars Marcus offered, as if they might disappear if she looked away. Her hands trembled as she accepted them, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, despite her obvious hunger. Marcus watched quietly, sipping coffee from a second thermos he'd brought while giving her time to satisfy the worst of her appetite. "Thank you," she whispered between careful bites. I can't remember the last time someone showed me kindness." "Everyone deserves basic dignity," Marcus replied. "I don't care what politics are involved." As Lyra ate, Marcus studied her more carefully. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, he could see that she was indeed young, probably early 20s in human terms. but her eyes held a depth of knowledge that spoke to the advanced education all Cytherians received. When she mentioned quantum mechanics earlier, she hadn't been boasting. Her people really were brilliant engineers and scientists. "Tell me about yourself," Marcus said. "What did you do before everything happened?" Lyra paused in her eating, her expression growing distant. "I was a doctoral student at the Cytherian Institute of Dimensional Sciences. My research focused on quantum tunnel stability in parallel universe matrices." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Ironic, isn't it? I was studying the very technology that destroyed our world." "You were trying to understand it, not weaponize it," Marcus pointed out. "There's a difference." "Try explaining that to the rest of the galaxy," Lyra said bitterly. "To them, every Cytherian is responsible for the dimensional cascade. We're all arrogant fools who got what we deserved." Marcus leaned forward. "What actually happened? I've heard the official reports, but—" Lyra's eyes grew haunted. "The project was called the Infinity Gate. We were trying to create stable portals to parallel dimensions, universes where resources were abundant, where we could establish colonies without competing with other species for habitable worlds. The theory was sound, the mathematics perfect." She wrapped her arms around herself. "But we underestimated the quantum resonance effects. When we opened the first full-scale portal, it created a cascade reaction that destabilized the quantum foundations of our entire star system." "How many got out?" "Maybe 2 million, out of a population of 12 billion. Lyra's voice was barely audible. "I was off-world when it happened, attending a conference on Zentari Prime. I watched my homeworld tear itself apart on the emergency broadcasts. The planet literally came apart at the molecular level. Buildings, people, everything just dissolved into quantum foam." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard the casualty numbers before, but hearing them from someone who'd lived through it made the horror real. "Your family? Gone. All of them. My parents, my younger brother, my research mentor, everyone I cared about." Lyra wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I've been drifting from station to station for 3 years now, trying to find somewhere that would give me a chance to start over. But everywhere I go, the answer is the same. No one wants to hire a Cytherian refugee." "What about refugee aid organizations?" Lyra's expression turned bitter again. "Oh, there are programs. Minimum subsistence allowances, temporary housing in overcrowded shelters, basic medical care, but they're all controlled by the major species who remember how we treated their refugees in the past. The Zentari make sure we get just enough help to survive, but not enough to thrive. They want us to remember our place in the new order." Marcus thought about the complex politics of the galactic community. Humanity was still learning the intricate web of alliances, grudges, and power dynamics that governed interspecies relations. But it sounded like the Cytherians had made enemies when they were powerful, and now those enemies were enjoying their revenge. "The irony," Lyra continued, "is that my people's research could actually help solve some of the galaxy's biggest problems. We understand dimensional physics better than anyone. We could develop new forms of clean energy, revolutionize space travel, even help with terraforming projects, but no one will listen to us because we're failed scientists who destroyed our own world." "What if someone was willing to listen?" Marcus asked quietly. Lyra looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you had a chance to prove your worth, to show that you're more than just a refugee?" That's impossible. I don't have credentials that any galactic organization would recognize. My university was vaporized along with everything else. I have no references, no portfolio, no way to prove what I know." Marcus smiled. "Maybe you don't need traditional credentials. Maybe you need something better, a demonstration." Over the next hour, Marcus explained his idea. New Geneva Station was more than just a trading post. It was also a testing ground for new technologies. The station's administrators were always looking for solutions to improve efficiency, reduce costs, and enhance safety. If Lyra could solve a real problem that the station's engineers couldn't handle, it would be proof of her abilities that no one could deny. "There's a power distribution issue in Section G that's been driving our team crazy for months," Marcus explained. "Random fluctuations in the energy grid that cause brownouts and system crashes. We've tried everything we can think of, but nothing works. The problem seems to involve some kind of quantum interference, but none of our engineers understand dimensional physics well enough to track down the source." Lyra's eyes lit up with interest. "Quantum interference in a power grid? That sounds like it could be dimensional bleed-through from parallel space. If the station's position happens to overlap with a high-energy location in a parallel dimension, could you fix it?" "Possibly. I'd need to analyze the station's dimensional resonance patterns, map the quantum fluctuations, and develop a compensatory algorithm." Lyra paused, her excitement dimming. "But I'd need access to the station's systems, and no one is going to give that to an unregistered refugee." "What if I could get you access?" Marcus asked. "Off the books, during my regular maintenance rounds?" Lyra stared at him in disbelief. "You'd risk your job for someone you just met?" "I'd risk my job to do the right thing," Marcus corrected. "Besides, if you can actually solve this problem, it won't just help you. It'll help the entire station. Thousands of people live and work here. They deserve reliable power." For the first time since he'd met her, Lyra smiled. Really smiled, not the bitter expression she'd worn before. "You know, when my people first encountered humans, we thought you were primitive and naive. We couldn't understand why you seemed to care so much about individuals instead of focusing on the greater good of your species. And now? Now I think maybe we were the naive ones. Maybe caring about individuals is what leads to the greater good." Marcus stood up and extended his hand to help Lyra to her feet. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up and see what we can do about that power problem. But first I want to introduce you to some people." "People?" "Other humans on the station. We stick together out here, help each other out when we can. They'll want to meet you." As they left the makeshift shelter, Lyra looked back once at the small space that had been her home for weeks. "I still don't understand why you're doing this," she said softly. "Your species gains nothing from helping mine." Marcus thought about his grandmother's stories, about his sister's courage, about the basic human instinct to help those in need. "Maybe that's exactly why we should do it," he said. The journey to Marcus's apartment took them through the residential sectors where many of the station's human workers lived. These areas were comfortable but modest, functional housing designed for people who worked with their hands and took pride in keeping the galaxy's infrastructure running. Along the way, Marcus stopped at several doors, introducing Lyra to his friends and colleagues. There was Sarah Kim, a hydroponics specialist, who immediately offered Lyra fresh vegetables from the station's growing bays. Tom Rodriguez, a communications technician who listened with growing interest as Lyra explained some of the theoretical work she'd done on quantum entanglement networks. Maria Santos, a cargo handler who'd grown up in the same kind of poverty Marcus had known and who understood what it meant to be hungry and desperate. Each introduction followed the same pattern: initial wariness as people met an alien refugee, followed by growing sympathy as they heard Lyra's story, and finally genuine welcome as they recognized her intelligence and dignity. These were people who judged others by their character and their willingness to work, not by their species or their past. "We'll figure out a way to help," Sarah promised, as she pressed a bag of fresh fruit into Lyra's hands. "Humans look out for each other, and as far as we're concerned, you're one of us now." Lyra seemed overwhelmed by the kindness she was receiving. "I don't understand," she said to Marcus as they continued toward his apartment. "Why are your people so willing to accept me? Most species I've encountered since the disaster have been less welcoming." "Maybe because we're still the new kids," Marcus suggested. We haven't been in galactic society long enough to pick up all the old grudges and prejudices, or maybe because we know what it's like to struggle. What do you mean? Marcus thought about how to explain humanity's history without sounding too dramatic. A few hundred years ago, we almost destroyed ourselves. Wars, climate change, resource depletion. We came very close to ending our civilization. We survived by learning to work together, to help each other even when times were tough. I guess that experience taught us something about resilience and second chances. When they reached Marcus's apartment, he showed Lyra to the small guest room he'd set up for when his sister visited from Earth. "You can stay here while we work on the power grid problem," he said. "There's a shower, clean clothes, and a real bed. Consider it payment in advance for your engineering consultation." Lyra sat down on the edge of the bed and ran her hands over the clean sheets as if she couldn't quite believe they were real. "Marcus, why are you doing this?" "Really?" Marcus thought about the question seriously. "Because someone needs to," he said finally. "Because you're brilliant and capable, and you deserve a chance to prove it. Because letting someone starve when you have the power to help them isn't just cruel, it's stupid. The galaxy is throwing away valuable people because of politics and prejudice. And if I can't solve the power problem, if I fail, then we'll figure out something else. But I don't think you'll fail." Marcus headed for the door, then paused. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start changing your life." As he left Lyra alone to process everything that had happened, Marcus reflected on the day's events. He'd woken up that morning expecting just another routine day of maintenance work. Instead, he'd taken the first step in what he sensed might become something much larger. He thought about the human colony ships that had first ventured into space, carrying people who were willing to risk everything for the chance at a better life. He thought about the explorers and engineers who'd built the first space stations, the diplomats who'd made first contact with alien species, and the workers who now kept the galaxy's infrastructure running. All of them had shared one trait: the willingness to see possibilities instead of just problems, to believe that things could be better if someone was willing to work for it. Maybe that was humanity's real contribution to galactic society. Not their technology or their military strength, but their stubborn optimism and their refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable. As Marcus prepared for bed, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. For the first time in months, his job felt like more than just routine maintenance. He was about to help someone not just survive, but thrive, and in doing so, maybe show the galaxy what humans were really capable of. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the main conference room of New Geneva Station's administrative center, watching as Lyra connected her improvised quantum resonance detector to the main display. Around the table sat the station's senior staff, including Chief Administrator Veltar, a distinguished Zentari with golden scales and sharp eyes, Chief Engineer Morrison, a no-nonsense human woman who'd built her reputation on solved impossible problems, and several other department heads representing various species. The transformation in Lyra was remarkable. Clean, well-fed, and wearing a proper engineer's uniform that Sarah had helped her obtain, she looked like the brilliant scientist she'd always been. But more than her appearance had changed. Her confidence had returned, along with the quiet dignity that marked her people at their best. "The power fluctuations in Section G," Lyra began, her voice clear and professional, "are caused by what we call dimensional bleed-through. The station's position in normal space happens to overlap with a high-energy astronomical event occurring in a parallel dimension, specifically a pulsar that exists in that reality, but not in ours." Chief Administrator Veltar leaned forward with skeptical interest. Marcus knew the Zentari administrator had opposed giving Lyra access to the station's systems, and had only agreed when the power problems began affecting critical life support functions. "Explain," Veltar commanded. Lyra activated her detector, and the main display showed a complex three-dimensional map of the station overlaid with rippling energy patterns. Every time the parallel pulsar emits a burst of energy, some of that energy bleeds through into our dimension due to quantum tunnel effects. The bleed-through is random because the pulsar's emissions are unpredictable, and the energy manifests as electromagnetic interference in our power grid. Chief Engineer Morrison studied the display with growing excitement. That's why we couldn't track down the source. We were looking for a problem in normal space. Exactly. The interference appears to originate from empty space because in our dimension, that space is empty. But in the parallel dimension, there's a massive energy source. Lyra manipulated the display to show predicted interference patterns. I've developed a compensatory algorithm that can predict the pulsar's emissions based on quantum fluctuation patterns. By adjusting our power distribution in real time, we can route around the interference before it affects our systems. Marcus watched the faces around the table as Lyra explained her solution. Initial skepticism was giving way to amazement, then to genuine respect. This wasn't just a fix. It was an elegant demonstration of scientific principles that no one else on the station understood. "Show us," Administrator Veltar said. Lyra activated the algorithm she'd programmed into the station's systems. On the display, they could see the power grid actively rerouting energy flow, creating buffer zones and redundant pathways that adapted in real time to dimensional interference. The random fluctuations that had plagued Section G for months suddenly smoothed into steady, reliable power delivery. "Remarkable," Chief Engineer Morrison breathed. "I've never seen anything like it." Administrator Veltar was quiet for a long moment, studying both the display and Lyra herself. "This solution will save the station approximately 2 million credits annually in lost productivity and equipment damage," he said finally. "More importantly, it ensures the safety and comfort of our 30,000 residents." "I'm glad I could help," Lyra said simply. "Help?" The administrator's tone shifted. "Dr. Vashitai, you have solved a problem that stumped our entire engineering department. This is not help. This is expertise of the highest order." He paused, seeming to make a decision. "I am offering you a position as Senior Dimensional Systems Engineer for New Geneva Station, with full benefits and citizenship sponsorship." Marcus felt a surge of triumph as he watched Lyra's eyes widen with shock and hope. Around the table, other department heads were already expressing interest in consulting with her on their own projects. I accept," Lyra managed to say. "Thank you." But Marcus could see that Administrator Veltar wasn't finished. The Zentari leader's expression had grown thoughtful, almost calculating. "There is another matter," Veltar continued. "Dr. Vashtai, your people were once leaders in dimensional science. How many other Catherian refugees possess similar expertise?" "Many of us were educated in advanced fields before the disaster," Lyra said carefully. "But most refugee aid programs don't provide opportunities to use that knowledge. That represents a significant waste of resources," Veltar observed. "I propose we establish a special consulting program here on New Geneva Station. We invite qualified Catherian refugees to apply for technical positions, with full evaluation based on demonstrated ability rather than political considerations." Marcus realized what was happening. Veltar wasn't just offering help out of kindness. He was recognizing an opportunity. Catherian scientists and engineers represented some of the most advanced minds in the galaxy, but they were available for a fraction of their former cost because of their refugee status. It was good business. "I know several colleagues who would be interested," Lyra said, her excitement growing. "Dr. Nethval is an expert in quantum computing. Dr. Zarathol developed new approaches to faster-than-light communication. Dr. Kevnar worked on zero-point energy extraction." "Excellent. Please provide me with a list of qualified candidates. We will evaluate each application on its merits." As the meeting broke up, Marcus found himself surrounded by congratulations from his human colleagues. Word had already spread through the station's human community about what they'd accomplished, and people were proud that one of their own had taken the initiative to help. "You did good, Chen," Chief Engineer Morrison said, clapping him on the shoulder. "That was some real outside-the-box thinking." "Lyra did all the technical work," Marcus protested. "Maybe, but you're the one who saw the person behind the refugee statistics. That takes a different kind of intelligence." As the conference room emptied, Marcus found himself alone with Lyra, who seemed overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her fortunes. "I can't believe this is real," she said softly. "A month ago I was starving in the lower levels, and now—" "Now you're exactly where you should be," Marcus said, "using your abilities to help people." Lyra turned to look at him, her purple eyes bright with unshed tears. "You gave me back my future. How do I even thank you for something like that?" "You don't need to thank me, but there is something you can do. Anything. Remember this feeling. Remember what it was like to be written off and ignored. When you're successful again, and you will be, don't forget about the people who are still struggling." Lyra nodded solemnly. "I won't forget, and I won't let my people forget either." 6 months later, Marcus received an invitation to the opening ceremony of the Catherian Refugee Integration Center, established on New Geneva Station, with funding from the Galactic Council. The program had become so successful that other stations and colonies were requesting similar initiatives. What had started as one human helping one refugee had grown into a galaxy-wide recognition that political grudges were less important than practical solutions. Marcus arrived at the ceremony to find the main plaza transformed. Where he'd first seen Lyra begging by the fountain, there was now a stage where speakers addressed a crowd of hundreds. Catherian refugees who'd been hired by various organizations stood alongside their new colleagues, sharing their stories and their hopes for the future. Lyra, now wearing the insignia of a senior systems engineer and serving as the center's technical director, spotted Marcus in the crowd and made her way over to him. "You came," she said, embracing him warmly. "Wouldn't miss it. How many people have you helped so far?" 237 Catherian refugees have found positions through the program, and we've expanded to help refugees from other displaced species as well. The Talvari, the Nexus Collective survivors, even some human refugees from the outer colony conflicts. Marcus looked around at the celebration, seeing species that rarely interacted now working together, sharing knowledge and building something better than what had existed before. "Your grandmother would be proud," Lyra said suddenly. Marcus looked at her in surprise. "How do you know about my grandmother?" "You told me about her stories, about how humans survived by helping each other. I've been researching human history, trying to understand what makes your people different." Lyra gestured toward the crowd. "I think I'm beginning to understand. Most species, when they gain power, use it to advance themselves at the expense of others. Humans seem to use power to lift others up alongside them." "We're not perfect," Marcus said. "We've made plenty of mistakes." "Of course. But when you see suffering, your first instinct is to help, even when it costs you something. That's rare in the galaxy." As they talked, Marcus noticed a commotion near the stage. A young Talvari refugee was being harassed by a group of Zentari traders who clearly thought the insectoid alien didn't belong in the commercial plaza. The situation was escalating, with security officers approaching but moving slowly, as if they weren't sure intervention was worth the effort. Without thinking, Marcus started toward the conflict, but Lyra caught his arm. "Wait," she said, smiling. "Watch." Marcus looked again and saw that other people were already intervening. Not just humans, but Catherians who'd been helped by the program, other refugees who'd found new opportunities, and even some Zentari who disagreed with their colleagues' behavior. The harassment stopped quickly as the troublemakers found themselves outnumbered by people willing to stand up for someone in need. "You see," Lyra said, "it's spreading. That Talvari engineer solved a water purification problem for the hydroponics bay last week. The Nexus survivor in Sector 7 designed a new air filtration system that's being adopted station-wide. When people are given opportunities to contribute, they prove their worth, and others start to see refugees as valuable individuals instead of just problems to be managed." Marcus watched as the young Talvari was welcomed into the crowd, already being introduced to potential employers and collaborators. "So what's next?" "We're expanding to 12 more stations and 3 colonial governments. The Galactic Council is considering making refugee integration programs mandatory for all major trade hubs." Lyra's expression grew serious. "But the real change is happening in people's minds. Every successful refugee placement, every problem solved by someone who was supposedly worthless, changes how others see displaced populations. And it all started with one person refusing to walk away from someone in need," Marcus observed. "It started with someone who saw a person instead of just a political problem," Lyra corrected. "That's the human gift. You see individuals when others see only statistics." As the ceremony continued, Marcus found himself thinking about his grandmother's stories again. She'd lived through humanity's darkest period, when climate change and resource wars had nearly destroyed civilization. But she'd also lived to see humanity reach the stars and make contact with other species. She'd always insisted that humans succeeded not because they were stronger or smarter than other species, but because they refused to accept that anyone was beyond help. Standing in the plaza, watching refugees from a dozen species working alongside established citizens to build something better, Marcus realized his grandmother had been right. The galaxy was vast and often cruel, full of ancient grudges and political calculations that reduced individuals to statistics. But it was also full of possibilities, of chances to prove that compassion wasn't weakness, that helping others was the fastest way to help yourself. Lyra had returned to her duties as host, moving through the crowd and introducing people, building connections that would last long after the ceremony ended. Marcus watched her work and smiled. She'd come so far from the desperate refugee he'd met months ago, but she hadn't forgotten where she came from. Every person she helped was proof that the galaxy could be better than it was. As the sun set through the station's dome, Marcus made his way home through corridors that now hummed with the voices of dozens of species working together. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to prove that the galaxy's diversity was its strength rather than its weakness. But tonight, Marcus was content to know that sometimes one person's decision to help could change everything. His grandmother's stories had been right. Humans did have something special to offer the galaxy, not their technology or their military might, but their stubborn insistence that everyone deserved a chance to prove their worth. In the distance, the station's newly optimized power grid hummed steadily, no longer troubled by dimensional interference. It was a small symbol of what could be accomplished when people worked together instead of against each other. And somewhere in the residential sectors, new refugees were settling into temporary quarters while they prepared for interviews and opportunities that wouldn't have existed without one maintenance engineer's decision to see a person in need instead of just walking away. The galaxy was vast, but it was also full of people, human and alien alike, who were willing to make it better, one individual at a time.